The Sunday school lesson for February 11th, 2024 is Faith in the Fiery Furnace, Daniel chapter 3, verses 19 through 28. Welcome, viewers and subscribers, to my channel, The Backstory and More. I am Audrey. If you are new here, notice the agenda. I will share the backstory, read the lesson text, and offer a brief lesson summary. The backstory takes us to the book of Daniel. Let's begin. The book of Daniel was written by Daniel. He is described as having the ability to understand visions and dreams of all kinds. He was able to relate to King Nebuchadnezzar the content of his dream when no one else could, then provide the interpretation. Daniel left no doubt as to the accuracy of his words when he concluded by telling the king, "This is the meaning of the vision." In response, the grateful king acknowledged Daniel's God as the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries. He also made Daniel ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all its wise men. Daniel then requested that his fellow countrymen, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, be placed as administrators over the province of Babylon. But their new positions of authority did not make them exempt from test of their faith. According to Daniel chapter 3, verse 1, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are on the plain of Dura. There, King Nebuchadnezzar built an image of gold based on chapter 2, verse 38. The image depicted the king himself. Anyone who refused to bow to the image faced death. Obedience to such a command clearly violated the first two of the Ten Commandments, Exodus chapter 20, verses 3 through 6. So the young Hebrew men refused to worship the image. Because the three Hebrew men refused to worship the image, their obedience was reported to King Nebuchadnezzar, who had the three men brought before him. The king offered them a chance to change their minds, but the three men restated their determination not to bow to the king's image. The narrative continues. Verse 13. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" The narrative continues. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. The backstory ends and the Sunday school lesson begins with verse 19. Verses 19 through 20. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. Verse 21. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. Verses 22 through 23. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Verses 24 through 25. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, Your Majesty." Verse 26. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." Verse 27. And the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Verse 28. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God." A brief summary. Although Nebuchadnezzar was furious at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he did not act rashly. He invited them in and allowed them to explain themselves. He gave them a second chance. Their response was something like, "There is no need for us to offer a defense of our actions." In short, they refused the second chance they were offered. Note that the king's request was not as drastic as it could have been, since he was not asking these Jews to stop worshiping their own God altogether. He was merely asking them to make a certain addition to their worship practice. Was this not the least they could do to pay him respect? Yet the modern habit of rationalizing questionable practices was nowhere to be found in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They knew that other gods were not to be worshipped alongside the God of Israel. God has no equal, and he will not tolerate being treated as if he does. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 35 and verse 39. Any action that grants unquestionable alliance to a sovereign other than God is idolatry. That's what bowing before the statue would have done. It was one thing to work for the king and show him the basic respect due to those in authority. It was another thing entirely to acknowledge a rival to God. These 3 Jews expressed faith in God in 2 ways. One, they acknowledged that God was able to deliver them from both the blazing furnace and the king, who thought he had absolute power. They did not worship a weak God or a distant God who was unable to intervene in events on earth. They worshiped Israel's God, who had proven his ability and who desired to work for the good of those who love him. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 9. These three men were firm in their worship of God to the point that they refused to bow, whether God chose to intervene or not. God's non intervention was a strong possibility. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were threatening the unity of the king's empire. If Nebuchadnezzar allowed them to walk free, he would appear weak and indecisive. So the king had to honor his decree and toss them into the fire. Not only that, but he decided to make an example of them by cranking the fire up so high that the men who threw them in died because they got too close. Nebuchadnezzar certainly was convinced. He referred to the Jews as servants of the Most High God. This praise culminated in a royal decree that protected those who worship Israel's God. Daniel chapter 3, verse 29. The point is clear. God is indeed the Most High God, and he will always prevail in the end. Those who worship him alone do so with this ultimate end in sight, regardless of short term suffering. Thank you so much for watching. Join me soon for the next backstory and more. Stay safe and may God bless.